Let me start by the term itself, and I guess you'll find so many definitions, and I do not think there's any one definition that is right or wrong. It is not a definition, as far as I know, that is in Arabic, which also is quite interesting. So you would not find, as far as I know, a word in Arabic that everybody would recognize as, yes, this is the translation of Islamism, which also tells you something. And to my mind, that has to do with what I think is a fact that Islam, up to the early 19th century, maybe mid-19th century, was basically the basis upon which almost every single state, dynasty, in the wider Middle East, the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, has based its rule. It was the only basis for legitimacy, if you'd like. It was the only basis for legislation. And in many cases, really the only. Few cases, perhaps one of many in which it was the dominant, but in the vast majority of cases, it was the only basis of legitimacy. Again, legislation, certainly identity for the vast majority of people in the region. And interestingly, even the non-Muslims were seen within the context of being non-Muslims, as opposed to citizens of certain countries. All of that changed, basically, from the early to mid-19th century. I'm not going to take you into a history lesson, but basically what I'm trying to say is that from that moment on, in these three areas that I focus on in the book, the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran, you had something different, or some things that are different, that try to replace Islam as a frame of reference for society, as a basis for political legitimacy, as an identity for societies. And from that moment on, I think you had very different types of interactions. Some of them were cordial, and some of them came from within the religious establishments that tried to find a way to maintain the traditional Islam as frame of reference for us, the identity, all of that, while not obstructing the unstoppable move towards modernity. Others, at different stages, disagreed with that entirely. And then from that moment on, you had these various types of interactions, some of which are very violent, some of that we see today, some of which are very, in my view, are very inspiring. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the difference between Islam and Islamism is relatively new. It's probably 150 years old, and that's, by our standards, very new. And number two is that today, the way I would focus on the difference between them is that Islam is a faith with so many various interpretations. Islamism are various ways, and they're really various ways, to retain these old notions of Islam as a social frame of reference, as the basis for legitimacy, as the basis for maintaining political legitimacy for any state. And I'm saying different interpretations because, as Professor Anderson mentioned, you have quite old interpretations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, relatively new interpretations, such as, for those who follow the Middle East, An-Nahda party in Tunisia, such as, of course, the AKP party in Turkey, which has been in power now for 10 years, such as the Iranian Islamic Republic in the last 30 years. All of these, in my views, are various interpretations of Islamism in the way we identify them. But there are other interpretations that were not political in any way. People who are constituencies, large segments of people in the wider Middle East who are very pious, very, very pious, very conservative. They see their interpretation of the religion as really their identity, as the only way to live life. And very few, until 10, 20 years ago, really had a direct connection between this piousness, this conservatism, and politics as we know it in terms of parliaments, presidents, constitutions, what have you. And one of the words we tend to use to describe these highly pious people, for them or for whom religion is the key factor really governing their life, is the word Salafists, which means nothing, by the way, in Arabic more than people who refer to the predecessors, which is such a generic term, right? So in order not to talk too much, I guess the point I'm trying to say is that you have a new phenomenon with various interpretations that has been politicized by different groups, and only in the last 10 or 20 years have become politicized almost by everybody, including groups that did not really link before their faith to the politics of their countries.